Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. This is the last of the lessons involving the Great War, and today we're looking at the distant or long-term effects of that. And to do that, we're going to sort of take a regional approach, looking at the long-term effects in different parts of the world, beginning with Europe. The Paris Peace Conference ostensibly was an attempt to bring people together, led primarily by the big three after Italy leaves. But one of the things that's unusual about this is the approach that was taken was not to sign one big treaty with all of the former Central Powers who had now lost the war. Instead, it's a series of individual treaties with each of the former states. One of the common things that all of these treaties have in common is that they're all going to have to give up land in some form. Another thing that's common is they're going to have to limit, if not completely disarm, their military capabilities, and they're going to have to pay money. Straight up, they're going to be forced to pay back, particularly Britain and France, in the cost of repairing everything after the war. Now, in the case of Germany specifically, their treaty is known as the Treaty of Versailles. So this is the treaty between the big three and Germany. The terms of this treaty, though, are quite interesting. First, Germany is forced to give up all of its colonies, specifically in Africa and in Asia, and we'll get into more later on how that plays out in different areas. But they have now lost all of their colonies. They are also limited to no more than 100,000 soldiers. Their military capability in the run-up to World War I, really the militarism got dramatic. The terms of this treaty say they can never have more than 100,000 soldiers. Now, as we'll see, they don't exactly follow that, but that is what they're supposed to do. They're also forced to pay reparations to Britain especially, but also to France, to the tune of around $33 billion. Now, that's in our U.S. terms, so that's adjusted. But here's what I want you to understand. We have individuals who are worth more than $33 billion now. In the period 1919, 1920, and throughout the 1920s, like, that is a whole lot of money. That is a huge financial burden for Germany. In that regard, you might remember Clemenceau was particularly interested in making Germany pay. They literally had to pay. There will be economic consequences from that. The other thing, though, is their whole political system is changed. Whereas they used to be the German Empire, they are now the Weimar Republic. It is a republic. There are elections, and that is a condition that is imposed on them as terms of this treaty. They don't get to decide that. Now, we'll come back to the consequences of that later on as well. But in addition to the Treaty of Versailles, there's the issue of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and parts of Germany. But one of the conditions after the Paris Peace Conference is the creation of new states in Europe. If you look at this map, the sort of pinkish, purplish areas are all new states that are created from former German and Austro-Hungarian territories. But the key feature here is, and this was an effect of Woodrow Wilson, each of these new states was granted self-determination. That basically means that they get to decide their own form of government. They are not colonies of any particular state. What's interesting to note, though, is none of those terms were granted to any areas of either former German colonies or the current British and French colonies. So that's the situation in Europe. But let's look outside of Europe, what's going on. Well, first of all, the United States has now emerged as kind of a global power. On the one hand, yes, it has to do with military power. Their troops especially that led in the surge of 1917 in the War of Attrition. But even more so, they are the biggest creditor to Europe now. In other words, they now have global economic leverage because they have lent so much money for the rebuilding of Europe after the war. So they're the world's main creditor, essentially. In addition to that, though, they sparked the creation of this new supranational organization, the League of Nations. Now, this was an idea that Woodrow Wilson promoted very, very hard. The idea is you create an international body of countries who work out their differences in discussions as opposed to having to fight wars. It was a very kind of idealistic but also novel approach. And again, it was Woodrow Wilson really pushing this as a way to avoid another great war. The strange turn of events, though, is even though it was Wilson in the United States pushing this creation, which was in fact created, the United States Senate never actually ratified the United States membership in the League of Nations. According to our Constitution, that has to happen anytime the United States signs a treaty. It has to be ratified by the Senate, and the Senate did not approve this. Their view was that this is sort of ceding sovereignty to some sort of international community. And so we'll see later on that has some consequences. The United States is not a part of this international organization that, in essence, they helped to create. Nonetheless, the United States is now in a really strong global position. But what about some of the other regions? Well, let's start with the effects in the Middle East. This is a complex story, but a really, really important one. First of all, though, we need to go back to 1916. There is a secret agreement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the British, the French, the Russians, and the Italians. This is during the war. Russia is still involved in the war at this point. And the basic idea is this. They're going to divide up the territory of the former Ottoman Empire. They anticipate they're going to win. The Ottoman Empire is going to get carved up. But what I want you to notice on this map is how exactly they are carved up. Russia gets part of it. This is basically going to add to their empire. But the French, British, and the Italians get both control of certain territories. That is to say, they're outright colonies. But then there's also these spheres of influence where they have economic control. A kind of hybrid model of colonialism and neo-colonialism in the spheres of influence. Now, this was the agreement made during the war, but after the war, obviously, the situation has changed. Russia is no longer a part of the coalition, and Italy ends up leaving the discussions in the Paris Peace Conference, and so they're kind of cut out as well. So what emerges instead, especially after the creation of the League of Nations, is something known as the mandate system. And the mandate system is a rather bizarre idea. It's not exactly a colony, and it's not exactly a territory or a protectorate. According to the mandate system, certain European powers are given control over territories, but the idea is they're supposed to do that in order to develop the local population. They're like serving as mentors. Someday down the road, you may be independent, and we're supposed to help get you there. It's a really unusual and bizarre sort of idea that's like a one step removed from the new imperialism that we saw earlier, but definitely not any sort of independence. One of the effects of this, though, is the rise of a kind of supranationalism known as pan-Arabism. You might remember the British in particular were fostering Arab nationalism as a way to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And there's certainly that if you look at this map, the Arabian Peninsula is largely now free of control, and there will be Arab states emerging there. But a big chunk of the spheres of influence that are controlled by the Europeans, as well as part of the colonies, also have Arabs. And so pan-Arabism is this idea that all Arabs need to unite to fight against Western imperialism, whether or not some believe there should be a giant Arab state. But what the idea was, it was against Western imperialism. That is the ideology that unites them. Now, in the area on this map that's labeled as Turkey, these are, by the way, the modern nations. What's going on there after the war? The Ottoman Empire is still technically in place, only its territory is extremely limited. Nonetheless, the nationalism, the Turkish nationalism that was spreading before the war intensifies. It is led by a guy named Kemal Ataturk. That becomes his name during this time period. Ataturk meaning father of the Turks. He leads a nationalist movement that eventually creates a secular state, the Republic of Turkey. It is completely secular, separation of church and state. It's not necessarily anti-Islam, but it is definitely a secular state. So that is one of the consequences in the Middle East. But another one that at the time was a very secret arrangement known as the Balfour Declaration is made. This is a really unusual situation. There's a secret agreement between certain Jewish leaders and the British that the area that is labeled Israel on this map, that's the modern countries, but at the time it was definitely not. It was what was known as a condominium of the international community. It was basically run by the League of Nations, but there was a secret agreement between the British and certain European Jews who were promoting Zionism. Zionism, again, is this idea that there should be a Jewish ethnic state. And the agreement, the secret agreement that was made was that that nation state would be created in the area that was controlled by the international community. Again, this will lead to the establishment of Israel later on, but at the time it was not Israel. The people living there were primarily called Palestinians. This, again, was a secret agreement that's going to have very long-term consequences. So we'll come back to that later on. But let's look at some other regions around the world. What about in South Asia? Well, before the war, the establishment of the Indian National Congress was made. Now, this was a giant organization of Indian subjects of the British Crown, and their primary goal was to get home rule. Now, I need you to understand something about this term home rule. There's two asterisks there because this is important. Home rule is not the same as independence. Home rule, which is what the Indian National Congress originally wanted, you are still technically a British colony, but you are allowed to have your own government. So the British will control your foreign relations, if you will, but you get to control your domestic policies. Now, this was the deal that white dominions like, for example, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, places like that, South Africa, even though it wasn't a white dominion, also had home rule. And so the initial goal of the Indian National Congress was exactly this, not necessarily the same as independence. Now, why did they expect that that would be a thing? Because they were the most involved British tropical dependencies. They had more people serving for the British than any of the other tropical dependencies. And again, we're excluding the areas that were white dominions or settler colonies. But the numbers are pretty staggering. Over 1 million served directly for the British, and many, many more indirectly. And so 100,000 casualties of those. They literally gave their lives for the British. And so there was this sense that, we kind of deserve home rule. We literally gave our lives for the British. Now, immediately after the war, the British passed what's known as the India Act of 1919. And the way this works is the British are giving some concessions to the Indians, but they absolutely will not give home rule. So, for example, the colony of India, the British Raj, is granted a member of parliament. They have representation, but that's about it. And that's not seen as far enough. The Indian National Congress is going to protest, and that leads to an event we'll look at more closely later on in the course, known as the Amritsar Massacre. And this becomes a sort of crystallizing moment for the Indian National Congress, particularly because it's now, okay, how do we get home rule? Like, nothing short of that is going to be enough. Now, Gandhi is a guy who, before this, he was in the Indian National Congress, but he was not a significant figure. We'll look much more closely at his biography later on. But he has an idea about how to do this, a way to get home rule, very unique at the time way of doing this. But eventually, he is going to become the leader of the Indian National Congress, and then that transforms. Instead of home rule, it's now about getting independence. Literally, we don't want to be a part of the British colony. So those are some long-term effects that we'll look at more closely, particularly as they relate to Gandhi and the independence movement later on. Let's look elsewhere, though, beginning in East Asia. Specifically, at first, China. What is going on here? Well, over 150,000 Chinese served officially for Western troops, although the number is actually much higher. This is the ones that served directly for the military, although not as soldiers in most cases. They were considered workers, and so they were like support troops. But if you look at the number of Chinese people who actually moved across the world independently in sort of a private capacity, it's well over 1 million people that served. Again, not officially in a military way. So there's an expectation that they're going to get something back. Well, what is that they wanted? Well, the biggest thing was they wanted an end to the spheres of influence. The new nationalist government that is in power in the Republic of China wants to be able to control their own economy. Now, that's not what happens. The spheres of influence are going to continue. There are some changes to that agreement made, but the West is still going to be heavily influencing the economy in China. Now, another twist to this, though, is Japan gets the Shandong province. That includes the port known as Qingdao. And you might recall that was given to Germany in the agreement that was made among the Western powers and Japan was quite resentful of this all along. It was one of the reasons they decided to join into World War I on the side of the Allied powers, hoping that they would get it. Well, they got it. But that, of course, is very upsetting to the Chinese. They thought it should be returned back to them. As a consequence, there's this growing dissatisfaction with the Republic of China, the nationalist party in charge, now known as the Kuomintang. And so a student movement breaks out on May 4th. It's basically a bunch of young, well-educated, Western-educated students who are really, really dissatisfied with the nationalists in power. Obviously, part of that involves the fact that they didn't really get much back after the Paris Peace Conference. But one of those students is a guy named Mao Zedong, who ends up becoming the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. We'll get into that more in the period after the war, but he's one of those students who's initially just dissatisfied with the nationalists in charge. But elsewhere in East Asia, we've also got Japan. Now, Japan joins the Allies, as we mentioned. Their primary motivation was they were hoping to get German territories after the war, and to a large extent, they got those. They got the Shandong province, including the port of Qingdao, and they've got significant islands in the Pacific that were former German territories. But there was something else they wanted after the war, and at the Paris Peace Conference, they lobbied hard for an official declaration from the, particularly the British and the French, that said that the Japanese were racially equal to Europeans. They wanted a public declaration of racial equality with white people. That did not happen. None of the European powers were interested in that. The United States largely stayed out of it. They took no interest on this. So that request was denied. There's a whole lot of bitter disappointment. So Japan views this as the big slap in the face. As a consequence, there are nationalist movements spreading throughout their conquered territories. A big one known as the March 1st movement in Korea. But remember, Korea at the time is a Japanese colony. But what's happening is nationalism is spreading even within the Japanese territories. So the March 1st movement does not succeed in any sort of immediate way, but Korean nationalism is now a thing and eventually is going to have a long-term impact as well. But the thing right now is Japan is not at all happy with the West. Yes, they got more territory, they got former German colonies, but what they really wanted was a declaration of racial independence, which they do not get. Then let's look at Southeast Asia. This is primarily, we're talking about French Indochina. So what's going on here? Well, about 50,000 officially served for the French, and most of them in worker capacities, in support capacities, not as soldiers. Nonetheless, there was an expectation they would get something back. Now, the representative for Vietnam in the Paris Peace Conferences was at the time a young man who was extremely well educated in Paris, Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh went around and tried to meet with every single representative of the big three and couldn't even get a meeting. And he wanted to discuss the eventual independence of Vietnam from French Indochina. Nobody was interested in talking to him about this. Now, you may be aware, if not, we'll come back to this in future lessons. Ho Chi Minh will eventually return to Vietnam, found the Vietnamese Communist Party, lead Vietnam first to its independence against the French, and then later in a war with the United States. So he becomes a figure of import later on. Then we've got the effects in the Caribbean. Now, about 40,000 served, particularly for the British, most of them in support capacity, although some of them were in fact allowed arms and served in segregated regiments. But many of them end up in a port in Italy, and the BWIR stands for the British West Indian Regiment. This was a regiment that was created by the British that combined people of color who were colonial subjects all throughout the Caribbean, the British West Indies. They are all serving in various fronts and end up back in Italy where they're sort of monitoring resupply outfits for the British. But one of the things that has happened is colonial subjects who are serving the British are meeting colonial subjects from other British colonies around the world. And there's this knowledge this spreading awareness that they are really getting screwed. They're not getting paid the same as white officers. They're getting different levels of treatment. There's this growing dissatisfaction. And the incident involves a straight-out revolt of the British West Indian Regiment. These soldiers serving the British, first, initially, they just refused to work. They just stopped work because they realize they're not getting paid anything close to what white soldiers are getting paid. They're not getting any of the respect they think they are due. And so this revolt breaks out. And it becomes a sort of lightning rod for, again, colonial subjects all throughout the world who, you think about it, like, they don't know anything that's going on in other colonies around the world, and that's quite by design. The British don't want them to talk to each other, but because of necessity, as you're moving around all these troops, there's this growing awareness that colonial subjects all throughout the British Empire, none of them is unique. They're all getting screwed. That is going to end up having an impact because, again, there's a growing resentment among colonial subjects, in particular in the Caribbean in this case, but also an awareness and a sharing of that resentment with colonial subjects elsewhere. Finally, we've got the effects in Africa. Now, one of the things that's unusual here is over 2.5 million served, many of them as soldiers. But primarily the way they served is they were being moved from one African colony to another part of Africa to fight in the wars there. So in the case of the British in particular, they would have colonial subjects, say in West Africa, who were serving as soldiers, but they'd basically be moved to East Africa where they're fighting against the German East Africans over colonies in East Africa. In other words, with rare exception, they were not allowed to fight in Europe, but they were fighting as soldiers. Consequently, it's not unreasonable they thought that they might get some political freedoms as a point of this. Nonetheless, they get nothing. Whereas European territories, particularly those that were part of Germany and Austria-Hungary, got self-determination. They got to set up their own governments and decide their own fate. None of the areas in Africa got any of that. One of the consequences of that is the rise of this supranationalism known as Pan-Africanism, in a way that's similar to the Pan-Arabism I talked about before. Pan-Africanism, this idea that all Africans, particularly black Africans, unite against Western imperialism. This is an idea that at the time right after the war just begins, but it's an idea that's going to spread and have consequences well into the later part of the 20th century. That leads me to an even longer term consequence effect that we'll come back to. It's so important that it's actually a separate unit, and that is decolonization. The idea that all of these places where colonial subjects had served, had helped the French and the British in particular, they're starting to want some of those ideas about independence and self-determination applied to them. But again, we'll come back to that in future lessons. I want to thank you for your attention. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.